Grids are a great device to transfer an image from one place to another. So if I have a photo I want to draw, I can draw a grid over my reference photo and then create another grid on my drawing paper and use that to help me get an accurate image faster and more easily than I otherwise would have been able to do. In a moment, I'll demonstrate this with a streetscape drawing, but first, let me show you the basic principle with a triangle. So here's the reference I want to copy, a triangle. I've drawn a grid over my triangle, and it just so happens that each of the three corners of my triangle is in the center of one of our boxes. So to transfer this accurately, I draw another grid. And I look at my reference and I say, well, each of the corners of these triangles is in the center of their box. So I find the corresponding boxes in my grid and I put a dot in the center of each, and I've transferred my triangle from my reference onto my drawing paper. And one of the advantages of this method is I can adjust the size of my box. So I might make my box a third of the size. And remembering that this is our original reference, again, I'm looking at where the corners of the triangle are. They're in the center of each of these three boxes. I locate these three boxes in the grid I've drawn on my drawing paper. I put a dot in the center of them. And again, I get an accurate representation of this triangle, albeit now a different size. If I'd drawn my boxes on my drawing paper twice the size as on my reference, or 1.5 times the size as on my reference, I would produce a drawing of the triangle half or 1.5 times the size of my original one. We do need to be careful though that we accurately keep the proportions of the boxes that are on our reference with what we create on our drawing paper. I have honestly seen grids that look more like this than that. And of course the problem is when we then go to transfer whatever points we want to use as reference from one grid to another, in this case the corner of each triangle, we end up with a triangle that's a very different shape to the triangle in our reference photo. And if the image we were transferring was, say, a person's face rather than a triangle, the distortion would be a lot more alarming than what we see here. And of course the grid doesn't have to be a square grid. I could use a 2:3 proportion or any proportion I want. The important thing though, if I use rectangular boxes, is that when I create the grid on my paper that I'm going to draw on, that the proportions of the boxes in my grid are the same. So if the proportions are 2:3 on my reference grid, I need to make sure the proportions on my drawing paper grid are also 2:3. Otherwise, I'll get that sort of distortion that we looked at a moment ago. So let's grab a reference photo now and put this into practice and see how it looks creating the grid on our reference, on our drawing paper, and then look in more detail about how we use it for a shape slightly more complicated than a triangle. The reference we're going to use using a grid is this one of a scene I came across in a recent trip to the city. The first thing we need to do is decide what sort of grid we're going to place over our reference. And I've decided to place a 4x4 grid. 4 boxes across and 4 boxes down. And because this is a rectangular reference, clearly my grid is going to be rectangular and not square. So the first thing to do is to measure the width. And that's 204 millimeters. So at 204 millimeters, I need to divide that by 4 to get the width of one box, which is 51 millimeters. So I'm going to place a dot at 51 millimeters, 102 millimeters, 153 millimeters, and that will be the width measurements for my grid. And then I need to do the same for my length. My reference is 250 millimeters long. That's not a number that divides evenly into 4. What I would normally do is knock off 2 millimeters, which gives me 248 millimeters. And so the length of each of my 4 boxes will be 62 millimeters. So going down the side, I'll need to put dots at 62, 124 millimeters, and 186 millimeters. And of course, before I do that, I need to take my 2 millimeters off the top. So here we have our reference nicely gridded up into a 4x4 grid. And to show the versatility of using the grid, I'm going to do my drawing half size, which means that my boxes on my reference paper are going to be 25.5 millimeters wide and 31 millimeters long. I use ink on my reference photo because that gives a nice clear line. But on my drawing paper, I'm going to use pencil because I do want to erase these lines at the end. I use a 3H pencil because I find that the line is dark enough to see clearly, but it's light enough that it can be erased without any smudging. So what we have now is a grid that's in the same proportions but half the size as the grid that's on our paper. What I do is I use this grid to locate the key points that I will use to transfer the drawing accurately. So for instance, with this close-up bush that comes down here, I can see that it passes through this corner of this square, which is there. I can see that it comes up to just under this square, and that at the bottom it comes down to about this far across into this square. So it's looking at proportions. I can also see that it comes up to reasonably close to this corner here. Now these two palm trees are very dominant in the scene, so I want to locate them accurately. Now what I can see is that the top of this one just pops into the bottom corners of these two and comes down to just a bit below halfway down this box. And it tracks down very closely on this center line. This one is also very close. Now the key points to note is where our reference actually crosses the lines and where key parts are positioned in proportion to the area of an individual box. So this corner of the building is almost halfway across, just a bit more to the right. And this corner of it is in this box here, maybe about there. And it takes up about a quarter of the width of this box, which will make it about there. Now I'll position this stone cottage next using the same method. I want to get this roof line in, and it's about a quarter of the way down the length. And this point is again about halfway across. It's actually quite level with that there. Now I have another tree that's behind this one. Now there is a hedge here that's just below this line. This chimney here is behind this line. Now this pathway is well towards the bottom of this section. So here we have my pencil outline of this scene. As I progress this pencil outline, I realized that the very first things I'd drawn a little bit large while I was still becoming accustomed to the scale I was going to have to draw here. So that was a good thing to notice and to keep going back and making adjustments. I haven't tried to do a proper drawing with the pencil because this is always going to be an ink drawing. And I've decided to do my ink with a 0.3 millimeter fine liner pen. So let's do that now. I need to establish this foreground foliage, even though it's tempting to start with the building, because although in many ways it's easy to see the building as the main thing, it still sits back in the picture plane. And so I need to adjust my line work for that. And I don't know what I'm adjusting to if I haven't drawn the foreground things first. Now, before I do this building, I need to work out what I'm doing with this jacaranda tree, which is largely still bare. Bit of a tricky thing to work out, particularly when it covers a lot of the building that we can still see through it. That will have to do for now. Now we have our cottage drawn in, and now there just remains the buildings at the back. Now, I want these to sit back, so I'm going to try and draw them fairly quickly with a very light touch. So I now have my drawing of this city scene that I've used my 4x4 grid to transfer accurately and quickly onto my paper. Now that's all that's left to do, if I'm sure the ink has dried, is to erase all of my pencil lines. Here we have them side by side. An easy, quick and accurate way to transfer a reference from a photo or a print onto a sheet of paper. Another quick but very important technique point is, remember, we're not doing a pencil outline to draw over. We're doing a pencil outline to establish where the main features of our main subject areas are in relation to each other. I use my pencil lines to do that, but I'm not trying to draw this in a pencil version here. I'm trying to establish where my ink lines will end up. When I come to drawing the ink lines, I don't just look at my pencil outlines and draw over them. To do that would be more like tracing than drawing. And tracing can often have a very lifeless feel to it, compared to the greater vigour that we find in lines that are actually done in a more freehand, brisker style. So even when I've got my pencil outline, I'm actually looking at my reference as though I had no pencil outline, working out where the lines are and what to do. At that point, I'm actually double checking my pencil outlines in many ways. And of course, with the pen, I draw the lines that I never drew at all with the pencil. Now, this isn't a method that I would ever use if I'm doing location sketching, and it's only a method I've ever used in one of my YouTube videos. But it is a method I use when I have a more considered larger scale drawing, such as, if you follow me on Instagram, the ones you may have seen. It's very good for establishing where the major lines are accurately, so that when all the effort of all the detail is put in, I don't discover that the basic shapes aren't quite right. It's a great technique to learn to use accurately. Why not give it a go? G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you found this interesting, and even more than that, possibly useful. But however you draw, have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.